Yamuna Dira Gopi Jana Balaba Giridhari Jasoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Jasoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Chamuna Tira Vonachari Chamuna Tira Vonachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Gopi Jana Balaba Giridhari Gopi Jana Balaba Giridhari Jasoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Jasoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Chamuna Tira Vonachari Chamuna Tira Vonachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnu Pada Paramahansa Pajikacharya Stotara Sat Shri Srimad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Goswami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnu Pada Paramahansa Paribrajikacharya Stotara Sat Shri Srimad Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Jai. ISKCON founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Shekha Host Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopinath Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhana Ki Jai. Shri Shri Vrindavan Dhamma Ki Jai. Navadvip Dhamma Ki Jai. Mayapur Dhamma Ki Jai. Shri Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai. Tulsi Devi Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Gangamaya Ki Jai. Jamuna Maya Ki Jai. Gaur Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. Shamaveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Narayanam namaskrityam naram chaivam narotamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jaya mudiraya nastaparayeshu abhadreshu nityam bhagavata sevaya bhagavati utamashloker bhaktir bhavati naishtiki. Reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, 15th chapter. What is it, 14th verse? Third verse. What is it? Third verse, 15th chapter, 14th verse. Sorry? 3:15:14. 3:15. Vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimitena dharme naradayam harim vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimitena dharmanaradhyayam harim Vishante yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimitena dharmanaradhyayam harim Vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha nimitena dharme naradayam hari Vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimitena dharme naradayam harim Vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimitena dharme naradayam harim. Ladies. Vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha nimitena dharma naradayam harim Vasanti yatra purushaha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimitena dharme naradayam harim. Word for word. Veshanti, they live. Yatra, where? Purushaha, persons. Sarve, all. Vaikuntik murtayaha, having a four-handed form similar to that of the Supreme Lord Vishnu. Yea, those Vaikuntha persons, animita, without desire for sense gratification, nimitena, caused by, dharmena, by devotional service, aradhayan, continuously worshiping, harim, unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Translation. In the Vaikuntha planets, all the residents are similar in form to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. They all engaged in devotional service to the Lord without desires for sense gratification. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The residents and the form of living in Vaikuntha are described in this verse. The residents are all like the Supreme Personality of Godhead Narayan. In the Vaikuntha planets, Krishna's plenary features as four-handed Narayan is the predominating deity, and the residents of Vaikuntha Loka are also four-handed, just contrary to our conception here in the material world. Nowhere in the material world do we find a human being with four hands. In Vaikuntha Loka, there is no occupation but the service of the Lord, and this service is not rendered with a purpose. Although every service has a particular result, the devotees never aspire for the fulfillment of their own desires. Their desires are fulfilled by rendering transcendental loving service to the Lord. Verse again, in the Vaikuntha planets, all the residents are similar in form to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. They all engaged in devotional service to the Lord without desires for sense gratification. First of all, I want to offer some thanks, he's not here, to Ramai Swami, who gave a very interesting and good version or rendition of a homage to Jayananda Prabhu on his anniversary of his departure. It was a very interesting talk. I heard it, and I had some personal association with Jayananda, and I'm going to, if there's time, I will read another thing that I dug out of my archives. I've read it before. It's a letter from one of Jayananda's high school classmates. I found it. Anyway, if there's time, I'll read the whole thing. So it's described that the residents in the form of living in Vaikuntha are described in this verse. So they're described, but it doesn't mean that they have achieved perfection. Prabhupada uses the word liberation a lot, but liberation is a kind of generic term. It means someone who is aware that he or she is not the body. And their realization can be in Vaikuntha or in Vrindavan or in the spiritual world. The spiritual world is not the spiritual palace. It's different, even though it's very large. It's the Tripad Vibhuti as opposed to the Ekapad Vibhuti. It's like three times larger than the material world. But one who is liberated into Brahma Jyoti is not perfect in life. And most of those people who are liberated into Brahma Jyoti have to return back to the material world because it is not necessarily perfection. There has been for many years, many decades, many centuries, an ongoing dispute between the Vaishnavas and the impersonalists. A very, very intense dispute has been going on. Nevertheless, when people gather somewhere in that land to chant the names of Krishna, because the people of Vaikuntha Loka worship Narayan, and because Hare Krishna is another name for Narayan, people gather by the tens or hundreds or even thousands sometimes to hear the white-skinned people speak about Krishna. It's very unusual. And even though they don't necessarily agree with Vaishnava philosophy, they're very impressed by Westerners taking up the chant, wearing devotional clothes, tilaks, and women wearing saris, and so on and so forth. So it's like that. And Prabhupada has told us that the goal, one of the goals of impersonal philosophy is that the last snare, he calls it, snare, S-N-A-R-E, or like a trap, is that they think that they're God. They want to actually become God. And that sounds almost impossible to believe, that someone wants to become God, but that's part of the impersonalist philosophy, that God is one and we're all God, and therefore we can all be worshipped as God. Just before I was initiated, I wrote about this in Miracle on 2nd Avenue. I was with a devotee named Raya Rama, and he said that, I don't know much about initiation, but I think if you want to do it, you can do it. It's going to be in about a week's time. And I said, initiation, what does that mean? And he told me, he said that initiation means that I asked Swamiji, that's what we called him then. I asked Swamiji, and he said that it means you think of the spiritual master as God. And I thought, that couldn't be right. He couldn't be God. How can a human being be God? And then I found out later that and it's written in the verse that by Vishwanath Chakravarti, Samsaradava Liga Loka, it's in one of the verses, that the spiritual master is honored as much as the Supreme Lord. So he's as good as God, but not God. It's like in previous times, especially before 1948, when England ruled India as the colonizer. They had what they called a viceroy. Viceroy means like the vice president or the vice king. Viceroy. That's roy means king, and or of the royal order. So then that made a lot more sense to me, but I didn't know what it meant. I thought initiation was some kind of a rite of passage that maybe Raya Rama got it a little bit wrong in saying that we worship Swamiji as God. But I thought, well, I'll do it anyway because I've come this far. So I was duly initiated in the first initiation. So what these residents of these four-handed residents are like is that they sometimes think that they're God because God is everything and everyone, and therefore they are God. And that's where they have gone wrong. And if it weren't for Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and more recently Prabhupada himself, to argue against the impersonalist concept, it would have continued to be very prominent. And as a result of continuous writings by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and more recently by Srila Prabhupada, it has come to mean that personalism is a force to be dealt with. It's a philosophy that it may be more difficult to understand and more complex and more complicated than impersonalist philosophy, but nevertheless it's gained a lot of prominence. Not a lot, but some, even though people gather by the hundreds and thousands sometimes to hear Hare Krishna's chanting. So four-handed people is a very unusual thing. As Prabhupada mentions here, we don't find a human being with four hands. So having four hands is not an ordinary thing. If you have four hands, you have to have four shoulders, and that means that there's four arms. And what it means is that these arms can all act at the same time. And it means that they have to pass through each other. If we analyze the physiology of a human being who usually has two arms, and we think of a being with four arms, it's almost inconceivable that the arms have to pass through each other on the shoulder, at the shoulder level. But that's what the residents of Vaikuntha aspire to. So having a form of four hands like Narayan means having four arms also. It's a very specific, it's a type of liberation. So liberation, and sometimes Prabhupada uses the word emancipation or salvation. It means that a person is thinking that they're not the body, that there's another dimension to life, higher than the human being form of life. So there are many instances in which people are liberated into Vaikuntha and worship Narayan, who is four-handed. I don't know if some of you know this. It's not exactly related to this, but during the Battle of Kurukshetra, Duryodhana was a little dissatisfied with Bhishma's fighting, and he thought that Bhishma wasn't fighting with full strength because he actually he was the grandfather and he was a mentor to the Pandavas. So Krishna informed Bhishma that he should go to Duryodhana and tell him he's got 5 arrows, and the following day he would collect these 5 arrows and he would kill all the 5 Pandavas with these 5 arrows. So he went to Duryodhana on Krishna's instruction the next day, and according to Kshatriya etiquette, Duryodhana was very, very brotherly to him. And he said, because that was the spirit of Kshatriyas, they were able to fight and at the same time sit at the night like sports players and have a conversation, eat together, joke together, and so on. And the next day they would be ready to kill one another. So Bhishma, on Krishna's instruction, went to Duryodhana, and Duryodhana, being very brotherly, said, "What do you want? Why have you come to me at this hour? If you want the kingdom without fighting, I'm ready to give it to you." That's how friendly they were. And Bhishma, on Krishna's instruction, said, "No, that's not why I've come, but I've come because at one time in the past you offered to give me a boon, and do you remember that?" And Duryodhana said yes. "And do you remember what that boon was?" And he said, I remember that I said I would give you anything you wanted." And so then Bhishma, acting on Krishna's instruction, said, "I want those 5 arrows." At that point, Duryodhana knew that it was the trick of Krishna, that he knew about these 5 arrows, and that they were designated to kill the 5 Pandavas. So he took the arrows, and Duryodhana offered to give them to him. But then he also realized that this was the trick of Krishna. So the next day, the fighting was very severe. And without these 5 arrows, Bhishma decided he would have to do away with all the Pandavas. So he was fighting very vigorously. And many of you have seen the photograph of the picture of Krishna trying to be prevented by Arjuna, because what happened when Bhishma was fighting so vigorously that some of his arrows struck Arjuna's chariot driver, who was Krishna. Of course, that was a Kshatriya thing, that they would disable the chariots by striking the chariot driver. So, but again, Krishna didn't like this because he was also very affectionate towards Bhishma. Bhishma had anyway, that's the story, and that's told in details in Prabhupada's conversations. So now, if there's time, I'm going to read this letter. If anyone has any questions, just read. You can ask about this verse or anything I'm going to read about Jayananda. His name was Andrew Hallam, and he lived in near Los Angeles in a place called, I think, San Marino or something like that. Yeah, San Marino, California. It's in San Fernando Valley, just north of Los Angeles. And this is after Jayananda departed. And this is his letter. "Dear Oakwood High School classmates and friends." And this is the guy that used to organize the class reunions every year, Andrew Hallam. "I want to tell you about my Christmas vacation trip to Durban, South Africa. The letter is about one of our classmates, Jim Kaur." That's Jayananda's legal name, Kaur, K-O-H-R, Jim Kaur. "While in Durban on December 29th and 30th, 1989, I attended each day the Hare Krishna Festival of the Chariots, being held on the beachfront. To give you an idea of the size of the festival, they fed 52,000 plates of food on the first day. It was a vegetarian feast and given free to all who wanted it, and it was very tasty, exclamation point. The chariot was 45 feet tall. It carried about a dozen people on it, throwing candies to the crowd. It was being pulled by members of the movement. The first day of the festival opened with a parade along Durban's Golden Mile in front of all luxury hotels. Golden Mile is capitalized. That's a place. That's a famous street, I guess, in Durban or Chatsworth. On the chariot are painted figures of Krishna and his consort, a wax museum model of the man who brought the Hare Krishna to the West. That's Prabhupada. And a photo of a man in Hare Krishna robes. The photo was about 2.5 by 3 feet. I asked my South African friend, who knows a lot about Hare Krishna, who the photo was of. He said he didn't know. The second day of the festival, my friend drew me into a conversation with a French woman who had lived in South Africa for 20 years and had been in the Hare Krishna for 11 years. I told her about my classmate who died in San Francisco in 1977 while active in Hare Krishna. She asked his name. I told her it was Jim Kaur. She asked me if the previous day I had seen the photo on the front of the chariot. She told me it was Jim Kaur, exclamation point. They all called him by his Christian name of Jayananda. But she knew him by his Jim Corps name too. And she knew about his college degree. I was flabbergasted, to say the least. That day, I spoke to about a dozen Hare Krishna members who all knew the full story of Jim Corps, or Jayananda, as they always call him. They all know about his death from leukemia, his strength at the end of his life, and his devotion to the Krishna movement. And these people have not been to the USA and probably joined Hare Krishna after Jim died in 1977, but they knew all about him. Here are some of the stories they told me. Jim took money that Mr. and Mrs. Corr sent him for painkiller prescriptions and used it instead to design and build a bigger and better chariot. Jim is responsible for the development of the Festival of the Chariots, and they hold these festivals worldwide. Once a year, they have a day honoring Jim, and they fast that day. In San Francisco, Jim was responsible for dealing with the outside community. People who didn't like dealing with Hare Krishna folk did like to deal with Jim. Jim is mentioned in one of the books written by the man who brought the Hare Krishna to the West. That's Nectar of Devotion, where he mentions Jayananda. You've probably seen that. The book is Nectar of Devotion. In their South African newsletter, that was being passed out in the festival, the book. Jim is quoted telling about the first festival in San Francisco in the 1970s, saying how primitive that chariot was in comparison to the present chariot, at least in Durban. The chariots are probably even bigger in the USA. Jim started it all. He directed his last festival from his wheelchair. I have a photo of the front of the chariot showing the photo of Jim. The photo was not taken to show Jim, since I didn't know at that time that it was Jim. And I have newsletter photos of the whole chariot to show the size of it. I'll bring these to the next OHS, Oakwood High School, reunion in 1992. One of the Hare Krishna devotees, as they call themselves, is going to send me a packet of articles on Jim, which have been written in their various newsletters over the years. During his last days in the hospital, Jim would not or could not eat. To tempt him, the devotees asked him what foods he wanted prepared. He said, cauliflower, which is dipped in batter and fried. When they brought it to him, he didn't eat it, but he rolled himself up and down the halls, giving it to the other patients. There may be some inaccuracies, but this is what his letter said. I had spoken to Mrs. Corr about 6 years ago, but most of it is pretty accurate. When I came upon a photo of Jim and me at summer camp in Minnesota in 1951, I sent it to her. Mrs. Corr told me how the Hare Krishna people in San Francisco had taken such good care of Jim and how well treated and respectfully treated Mr. Corr and she had been on their trips to San Francisco to visit Jim at the end. How modest Mrs. Corr is! Exclamation point. I called Mrs. Corr long distance, Mrs. Corr long distance from Durban, South Africa, to ask her, "Do you know who your son is?" She said, yes. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Corr, Jim and Jane. Mr. and Mrs. Corr, Jim and Jane, live at, and then he had an address. I won't go into that. Mrs. Corr explained that their street is called 20 and a half because it is 20 and a half miles from the Utah border. I had tracked them down through Sherwin-Williams Paints when I remembered Mr. Corr had worked. I talked again with Mr. and Mrs. Corr just last weekend to tell them what a powerfully moving time I had in Durban. I was a celebrity at the festival because I knew Jim! Exclamation point. I was asked all about his family. I was asked what brothers and sisters he had. I was told he must have been a very spiritual family. The founder said Jim was really pure. Now, I hope I explain the next properly. As I understand the Hare Krishna movement, and I may have it all confused, one is reincarnated again and again until he perfects his life enough to go to be with Krishna or God. They believe that Jim has gone directly to Krishna's abode and has no further need to be reincarnated. He doesn't need any more perfecting. He has achieved it all. I was repeatedly asked, what was Jim like in school? Well, you know, that was quite a few years ago. I had even forgotten or just not given a thought to the fact that Jim and I lived in the same cabin in summer camp. I forgot that until I came upon the 1951 camp photo. I forgot that until I came upon the 1951 camp photo. And the photo of Jim on the front of the chariot is unrecognizable because of the years. The Hare Krishna robes Jim is wearing, and because, as they had said, the photo is not a good one because it was not taken until Jim was very ill. I told them that Jim was very funny. They said they could believe and understand that from what they had heard about him. I was told that Jim worked very hard. When Jim cleaned the garbage cans, he cleaned them so well because they were Krishna's, quote unquote. New devotees would see his work and think, if this is how thoroughly the garbage cans have to be cleaned, how must the more important work be done? Quote unquote. One time, when Jim was a leader, he returned late at night and saw that a chore had not been done properly. Rather than awaken the offender, Jim did the job over and over again. Jim could run on very little sleep. A surprise birthday party was given for Jim, but he was truly embarrassed by all this attention being directed at him. So now, the next time you see a Hare Krishna devotee on the streets, Andrew Helm has departed. Go up and tell him or her that you went to school with Jayananda. You'll get red carpet treatment. The story of Jayananda will be known! Exclamation point. And remember, I was in South Africa, which is 11,000 miles from Los Angeles, and they all knew! Exclamation point. So I think we went a little over time. If you have any questions on the verse or anything I've read about Jayananda, please ask or sound off. And maybe if you ask about him, it will trigger some other memories that I have. Okay, we'll stop there. Oh, go ahead.
Do you recall your first time you saw Jayananda? Where?
The first time I saw Jayananda, he was driving a taxi cab, and he came. That was in San Francisco, and he came into the temple, and he expressed a lot of interest in what was going on. Even though he was over 30 years old, and most of us were barely even 20, and some were younger than 20 years old. So we thought, if a person that old is interested in Hare Krishna, that's a very strong endorsement. He was the oldest person to join. That's when I first met him. Any other comments or questions?
Gurush, you met him in one of the programs, or?
I met him. There was not a program going on. He just pulled up in his taxi cab and walked into the temple and had a lot of questions and talked to some devotees. There wasn't a festival going on, but it was a very auspicious occasion in that sense. That's how I met him. Any other comments or questions about anything? I can find it. I'll read the verse again. Chapter 15, verse 14. 15. Yeah. Vasante yatra purusha sarve vaikunta murtayaha ye nimita nimitena dharma naradayan harim. In the Vaikuntha planets, all the residents are similar in form. In the Vaikuntha planets, all the residents are similar in form to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. They all agree in devotional service to the Lord without desires for sense gratification. Sorry? Get the microphone, I can hear you better.
There's one memory of Jayananda that I just recalled then. I think I'd read it somewhere where Jayananda was sleeping in a Bhagavatam class when Prabhupada was giving it. And the devotees were, waking him up, and Prabhupada said, "Stop, let him sleep. He works harder than all of you put together."
The only discrepancy is it wasn't a class, it was a darshan. Prabhupada was having an
thank
informal
you.
darshan with about 7 or 8 devotees. And Jayananda, who had been up all night building on the Rath car, was starting to nod out, even in the middle of the talk by Prabhupada. And that's when he was nudged. And that's what happened. That's the story that I wasn't there, but I heard that from a few other people. So it must be accurate. Any other comments or questions? So I have this copy of this letter. If anyone wants it, you can have it. It's too late. I'll get you another one. I have it. I can print it out for you.
And I think it was on record that Prabhupada mentioned that Jayananda went to the spiritual world. Is it somewhere?
Yeah, that's what the letter said. I think when I read the letter, that he heard that after Prabhupada heard that he had departed, he said that he has gone to the spirit. That is the only letter that I know where Prabhupada has said that anyone has gone to the spiritual world. Anyone who departed this world has gone to the spiritual realm. He didn't say it was necessarily in the place of Krishna's pastime, but that was indicated. He said the spiritual world. I mean, if anyone wants to know, I think that speech is recorded and the verbatim letter is in there. Okay. Anything else?